Joining us now, live in New York City, is Liz Peek. You can read Liz Peek, foxnews.com, Financial Times. Also follow her on Twitter at lizpeek.com. Hey, Liz, good to have you with us.
Thank you. Good to join you this morning.
Let's start with the Italian situation. We've got a lot to cover: Italy, Taiwan, Japan, HUD, Iraq, all in about 12 minutes. So we got to really
around the world
about 15
in 12 minutes,
right? So we got to really roll.
The Italian referendum, basically, which is what it was, basically bounces now another leader in Europe, another traditional sort of mainstream leader, although this one was extremely young and had promised to shake up the sclerocracy, or whatever you want to call it, of Italy's government. It's going to be read as another indication that people are dissatisfied with traditional politics in Italy. This is not, I don't think, quite this in the same vein as the kind of forces that are rising in France and Germany, but it's definitely another Eurosceptic vote, and I think that is alarming to people, and it's alarming to financial people because the three top banks in Italy are not sound, and they need to be propped up by investor money, and investors naturally will be somewhat skittish of a country that seems to descend into political chaos at the drop of a hat and is likely to do so again.
Let's get to that for a second. What the referendum was actually over the weekend in Italy is the prime minister was trying to streamline the government, or they called it a governmental streamline, through a series of constitutional amendments that would have increased the power of the prime minister and diluted the power of the Italian Senate, or the upper chamber, if you will. And then with that, what the prime minister wanted to do was push through more globalization type initiatives through Italy. So that was the catalyst for the thing getting beat, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, again, it's Europe over Italy, and I note that the last paragraph of the coverage in the New York Times actually quoted an Italian. They never seem to actually go to the source of the vote, and the person said, yes, it might have been good for Europe to go along with this referendum, but what about Italy? And I think that's the kind of question that's being raised in country after country, and including here. That is to say, is the greater world order something that people should be voting for, or should they be looking at their own situation, their own borders, their own pocketbooks? And again, this is obviously out on the heels of Brexit, and then, of course, being likened to the vote for Donald Trump. A time when a lot of working class people in particular, but I think people generally, are beginning to feel that this ultra globalism, which has taken the place of nationalism, is something that is perhaps better in theory than in reality, because what it's really done is just hand an awful lot of decision-making, rule-making, et cetera, to people who have no connection to the voter. And I think that is something in the case of Brexit, and I think it's true in the United States, and I think it was true in Italy, that people are just saying, enough of this. We really want our rulemakers to be accountable. As you know, the people in Brussels who run the EU are literally the definition of out-of-touch bureaucrats. They spend all their time counting tea leaves and coming up with mysterious rules that are then imposed upon the inhabitants of the countries that make up the EU. And the Brits, for example, got tired of that. They were, they were about to have their favorite electric tea kettles outlawed by these bureaucrats in Brussels. That is part of what's going on here. And I think also you have to acknowledge that the EU's acceptance, and particularly Germany's acceptance of 1 million refugees plus, has been a really destabilizing issue in Europe. And, Angela Merkel comes up for election next year. I really think she's in trouble. I think the German people are going to say, you know what, we're not happy in this country of 80 million to have had perhaps as many as 2 million Muslim refugees taken in, not only is it economically destabilizing, it's socially destabilizing
Right.
and culturally difficult. And that's something that the sort of globalists just don't get, or they're not willing to understand that. So, I'm not surprised by this. Now, in Austria, what could be considered a mainstream candidate did beat out a far-right candidate, the kind of person who in this era is taken much more seriously than usual. But that was more of a ceremonial post. It's not necessarily doesn't have the impact of the Italian vote. But so, it was a little bit of a leaning against the wind vote in Austria. It gives maybe a little optimism to Angela Merkel that, it's not a one-way street, that not everyone is going to be rejecting globalism and the EU, but it's not as important, as I say, as the Italian vote.
Well, I think she's going to go down when that comes up because, look, she's got about 18 months, I believe, before she's got to stand for re-election, Angela Merkel. And the problem is things are going to worsen in Germany over the next 18 months because of the number of refugees she's taken in, the number of immigrants that have come in. They're not assimilating. They continue to take them. It's not like they said, okay, we're done with 2 million. They continue to flow in. And it's the non-assimilation. As you mentioned, Liz, it's beyond now economics. It's a destruction to the normal German social order because these Muslim refugees that have come in from wherever they are not assimilating into German culture. They set up their own communities, basically, and they expect the Germans to assimilate with them, rather be the opposite. And, this is really going to be an issue there in Germany. And
I think it already is.
Yeah.
And, the German authorities now are very much on defense, having kind of covered up the New Year's Eve events of a year ago where women were groped by the dozens in the streets and so forth by these young immigrants who ostensibly don't know any better. Well, they do know better, but they basically are not, as you point out, they're not really assimilating. And I think the Muslim culture is just a very difficult one, frankly, to have assimilate. So, which is why you have very particular neighborhoods in most European countries now where Muslims live, and they really are pretty much worlds unto themselves. So it's a problem. And I think the more that the authorities and people like Angela Merkel pretend it's not a problem, woe be to them, because, people are not that stupid, and eventually people respond. Which brings us to an interesting story in the news this morning, I think, about how California is going to go to great lengths to protect illegal immigrants in that state from federal deportation or any kind of move by Trump to deport people here illegally. And I think, I really want to spend some time looking at the financial situation in California because it's an expensive thing. In California now, as you know, undocumented people are allowed to get driver's licenses. And they also now are allowed to get Obamacare, I believe. They have been pushing for that at least. And now legislators in California, and all of them are Democrats and most of them are Hispanic, are also suggesting that the state should provide support for Obamacare fees. I think California is losing businesses hand over fist because the taxes are so high there. You do kind of wonder if California isn't going to get to a breaking point where they simply can't afford to do this.
Well, it's going to be a matter of time. And then also, Obama proved that if states don't go along with the policies he wants, he was willing to cut their funding in various areas, right?
And that could happen here.
It's going to happen here. Obama set the precedent for that. President Obama did. I have no doubt in my mind that knowing President-elect Trump as I do, he wouldn't hesitate to make that same threat if things are going counter to the way the administration wants. And again, I can't blame him for it because Obama set the precedent with all these executive orders and threatening to withhold funding to Texas schools and things of that nature. So I want to move on to a couple other topics here. Let's get to Taiwan. President-elect Trump speaking to the Taiwanese president over the weekend, and the statists and those that are professionals, bureaucrats in the State Department went crazy, saying that China was going to be upset. And, oh, my God, how could he do such a thing? And you can't disrupt the order this way. And the Chinese will be upset. And basically, Trump's response was, too bad.
Yeah.
What say you?
And I think it's a shot across the bow that, yes, indeed, he wasn't kidding when he talked about reevaluating and possibly disrupting some of our international relationship norms. But, you have to kind of, I don't know about you, but I sat back and I said, okay, let's think about this. We're spending a fortune. We're giving Taiwan a fortune every year in defense material, et cetera. Why is it we should not be talking to them? Oh, right, because we might make the Chinese unhappy. Well, so what? I mean, the Chinese aren't exactly behaving very well right now. They've obviously been extremely aggressive in the South China Sea. They have lied to the world community and, by the way, to President Obama about their intentions in that region. They are supporting, continued support North Korea, even though they, yes, went along with UN sanctions recently. The truth is North Korea would not be hurtling towards nuclear capability without the underlying support of China. So I'm not quite sure what it is we're so worried about in terms of rattling their chain and maybe having them respond. It seems to me that Americans are kind of ready to have a government that stands up to China. We are still the number one country in the world in every possible respect in terms of wealth and military capability, et cetera, but we haven't been behaving that way for a great many years. And in the case of Obama and China, he could never stand up to China because his number one ambition was to conclude a climate deal that was completely toothless and yet has become one of the much heralded accomplishments of his time in office. So that was his number one priority. It's a completely bogus agreement. The front page of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago talked about China ramping up coal production and use. That's what they're doing. They're not really doing anything about climate change. They simply went along with it because it looked good in the headlines and allowed them to do all this other stuff, and particularly the assumption of property in the South China Sea, basically uncontested because they knew that was Obama's big dream. So, I think a reality check is kind of what we're having here. I think it's great.
Well, look, number one, on the climate change deal, that was a complete joke. That was no deal. It was basically us saying what we were going to do. The Chinese government said, well, maybe we'll look at it in 2050, maybe. Meantime, we're shutting our coal plants down. They're constructing in China a coal plant a month, like clockwork. Every month,
exactly.
New one comes online.
And remember that one of our great competitive advantages is cheap energy.
Right.
So, as China labor rates go up, cheap energy is incredibly important to them, and they're going to use whatever it takes. And what it takes right now is coal. So It's a bogus agreement, but for 8 years, we have basically kowtowed to the Chinese in order to get that agreement and look the other way on every other matter.
Makes no sense. Now, you know what this reminds me of? When Trump talked to the Taiwan president and all the statists went ballistic over it, all over the news. It reminds me of the first month that Reagan was in office. He drafted a letter that he wanted to send. You probably remember this, to Leonid Brezhnev, the USSR honcho at the time. And basically in that letter, he wanted to outline to him that things were going to change. And I remember when he drafted it and sent it. Remember at the time we had these people in the State Department called Kremlinologists? Remember that?
Sure.
Kremlinologists, right? And there was a whole bunch of them. It was a big rat's nest in there. And all they did was they would evaluate what was going on in the Kremlin. And it was this huge bureaucracy of Kremlinologists. And all the Kremlinologists went crazy. You can't send this. You can't do this.
Right.
The president can't
that.
do that. Remember that? It went on and on and on. It was a big uproar that Reagan was violating all the things that they had understood about dealing with the Kremlin through the State Department Kremlinologists. And it all turned out to be what? Bogus! Because look what happened,
and it's actually
right?
a very good analogy, very good data point. Because it was absolutely inviolate policy, and it was yielding nothing.
Nothing. Right? I mean, and
I totally agree.
You can criticize Reagan on anything you please, and that's fine. It's open fodder, but you really can't criticize how he destroyed the entire USSR. So on that, he was 100% correct every step of the way. But it's the same thing when I started hearing these people complaining about upsetting the standard tradition of this and that. It reminded me of that and how just wrong these people are. So it's kind of ridiculous. I've got 1 minute. Give me your final word. The president of Japan coming to visit Pearl Harbor. What do you think?
I think it's high time, and because after all, Obama went to Hiroshima. And with that, I have to say thank you and goodbye. Have a great
Peak,
day.
Thanks for being with us. You can follow her at Liz Peak, Fiscal Times, Fox News, or LizPeak.com. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network.